in the face of the increasingly difficult wartime situation. Before the books arrived on this side of the Channel, however, Grace had to leave London with her young family for the relative safety of a Welsh farmhouse. Stranded in the country, away from the work she loved, Grace wrote to Harold on the 2nd of October 1939, "I feel almost as though I had quietly died and still had knowledge of life and the hope of returning to it." Harold clearly felt her absence just as keenly, writing, "The departure of Mrs. Hogarth from our firm is one of the many disasters of the war, but all of us here look forward to a time when she may be working with us again." Grace's correspondence with Harold from her Welsh exile gives a blow-by-blow account of the Ray's book's journey from France, including disputes over an import license, the voyage by sea, and their eventual arrival. The delay in distribution and the absence of a dedicated children's editor on the ground to promote them meant that the titles never really took off with British booksellers. Grace wrote regretfully to Harold in January 1940, "I'm frightfully disappointed in sales, and I do feel like I could have helped. I'm more and more convinced that children's books can be sold by applying personal pressure in the right directions. I could have done far more if it hadn't been for the war." Meanwhile, Paris was becoming an increasingly dangerous place for a Jewish couple, and Harold and Margaret Ray, the authors of the Raffi and Fifi series, fled from Paris across Europe on 2 homemade bikes, eventually arriving in New York in October 1940. Although popular accounts of the Rays' journey to America imply that the couple carried the Fifi and Raffi manuscript with them on their journey, correspondence in the Chateau archive suggests that manuscripts of the books were already in the US under the watchful eye of none other than Grace Hogarth. Grace had moved to America in the spring of 1940 and was determined to find a worthy home for Ray's titles. She wrote to Harold Raymond that summer, telling him that the manuscripts of Fifi and Raffi were in the possession of Miss Fish, an editor at Stokes, an American publishers. As she wrote to Harold, "I told her to keep them in her safe pending instructions." As soon as Grace secured a position in the children's department of Houghton Mifflin, a large US publishing house, she was quick to show off the Ray manuscripts. Finally, having made contact with the Rays on their arrival in America, Grace did the deal and secured the rights to Raffi and Fifi books. She wrote to Harold and told him that it had been decided that Fifi would be the first book to be produced, and as there had been another book that year with a character of the same name, the name would be changed to Curious George. The rest is history. The Ray's monkey, after a rocky start, became one of the best known characters in American popular culture. Since its first publication in 1941, Curious George has remained continuously in print, and over 25 million copies of the Ray's original books have been sold to date. Reading the exchange of letters that surrounds this little slice of history made me think about the fragments of human stories that are embedded in these archives, and of the quiet heroism of people going about their daily business amidst a backdrop of uncertainty and even peril. Even more significant to my research, however, were 2 other aspects of this story. Firstly, the relationship between the US and UK children's publishers during this period. And even more importantly, the fact that Grace Hogarth's pivotal role in the Curious George story has been largely forgotten. This oversight is, as I was to discover, a recurring theme within general publishing history, and my research addresses the omission of women who played key roles in the development of 20th century children's books. To set the scene, I'll now talk briefly about the state of British children's literature in the period between 1930 and 1960. This period has also been somewhat overlooked, sandwiched as it is between the 2 golden ages of children's literature. I'm sure you'll all recognise the key texts of the first golden age, the canon of Edwardian juvenile fiction, which includes The Wind in the Willows, Peter Pan, The Water Babies, and the works of E. Nesbit, to name but a few. Dates for the second golden age are more contested, but largely recognised to start in the late 1950s and early 60s, with authors including Alan Garner, Ursula Le Guin, Susan Cooper, and William Mayne. The period in between these 2 golden ages has been disparaged as a brass age, filled with derivative series fiction, poor quality reproductions of tired anthologies, and of course, the dreaded Enid Blyton, although she too is the subject of some recent critical reappraisal. However, it was during this period that the publishing houses really began to pay attention to children's books and how they were selected and marketed. It seems obvious too that something interesting must have been going on in children's publishing to enable this second flourishing. The new wave of children's publishing, which thrived in the 60s, cannot have emerged from nowhere. A group of bookwomen, not just editors, but librarians, illustrators, and authors, played a pivotal role in these developments. You may not recognise any of the three women I'm going to talk about this evening. So we've got Eileen Colwell, Eleanor Graham, and Grace Hogarth on the far right. But they will all have undoubtedly had an influence on your childhood reading or your parents' childhood reading. You'll notice I'm hedging my bets here. When Grace Hogarth arrived in London in 1936, she was surprised at the difference in attitude to children's books in England compared to America. The most striking contrast in the two countries' approach to children's publishing, she observed, was the attitude to the market. She wrote, "My American training perhaps had led me to have a very warm feeling for the word. Its magic had always produced a picture in bright colours, a picture of hundreds of happy children reaching eagerly for books. The pleasant fact remained that in America, one could and did make and sell beautiful books for the children to a market that absorbed enough copies to make publishing quite worthwhile." The market that Hogarth describes in America had not materialised accidentally. Whilst Britain was still struggling to regain economic momentum following the First World War, the publishing industry in America was thriving. As families increasingly found themselves with money to spend on their children, the major US publishing houses were alive to the new sociological and psychological positioning of childhood within a burgeoning consumer culture. In 1919, George Brett, president of Macmillan Books in the US, appointed a young woman called Louise Seaman to head the first children's department in the country. He chose her because, in his own words, "I suppose that's a subject on which a woman might be supposed to know something." Such was Seaman's success at Macmillan that within 10 years, at least 6 other US publishers followed suit and appointed women editors to head up newly created children's departments. Children's literature was therefore viewed in America as something to be encouraged and valued, and cultural and institutional structures reinforced these ideas. Provision for children was becoming an intrinsic part of public libraries, and prestigious children's literature prizes such as the Caldecott and the Newbery Awards, founded in the early 20th century, helped shape the canon of children's books in America. The picture was somewhat different in the United Kingdom, however. It was not until just prior to the Second World War that British publishers began to appoint specialist children's editors. There was little space dedicated to children's book reviews in the mainstream press, and few specialist publications devoted to children's literature. Similarly, there were no organisations or bodies to support activities specifically related to the field. All of these developments were to take place in the UK by the early 1960s, and it is significant that many of the initiatives that gained momentum within the intervening period, from literature prizes to library book weeks to professional organisations, took their lead from American pioneers of 20th century children's literature. Equally significantly, it was the work of predominantly women, stretching across both sides of the Atlantic, that provided the impetus for the increased cultural and economic importance of children's books. When Louise Seaman was planning a business trip into the UK in the mid-20s, George Brett refused to give her a letter of introduction to the Macmillan's London office, explaining that his British colleagues would never understand my allowing a young woman to be head of a department. Another unnamed British publicist was quoted as commenting, "Amazing the way you Americans entrust such very important jobs to mere girls. Is Miss Seaman really the head of a Macmillan department?" Although this appointment might have caused consternation amongst Brett's British colleagues, the fact that the department that Seaman had been given to lead was the children's department would have gone some way to explaining her position. Such attitudes towards women in the industry were echoed in the general approach to children's literature in Britain during this period. As Grace Hogarth discovered, therefore, on her arrival at OUP in 1936, the state and status of children's publishing in the UK was far behind the US. She discovered that the children's list at OUP's London office consisted largely of reward books, reworked, poorly produced anthologies of stories, churned out to meet the demand for relatively cheap material that could line library shelves and be given as gifts. Another key difference noted by Hogarth was the relationship between publishers and librarians. What was a mutually beneficial and a supportive relationship in the US appeared mired in bureaucracy and distrust in the UK. For example, Hogarth initially faced suspicion from the British Library Association when attempting to recreate the positive links that flourished between American publishers and librarians. A letter from the Secretary of the Library Association, written in 1939, in response to Hogarth's request to attend its conference, was unpromising. I am very sorry, but the Council has made a strict rule that applications from non-members to attend the conference be made before the 31st of January, in order that the Council may have the opportunity to consider such applications and, if necessary, issue an invitation. Your application was received much too late for this, and there is no further meeting of my Council before which the matter can be laid. Hogarth circumvented bureaucracy by taking a typically personal approach. She wrote to Eileen Colwell, a pioneering children's librarian at Hendon Library. She wrote, "I want very much to ask you about possible cooperation between publishers and librarians in this connection, and wonder if it would be possible to see me if I went to Hendon for this purpose. I can arrange any time to suit your convenience." In doing so, Hogarth achieved her aim of winning support from one of the most forward-thinking and progressive librarians working in children's books, and in the process, they forged a long and mutually beneficial friendship. Now I've introduced Eileen Colwell, I'll talk a bit more about her and the way in which the growth of children's libraries played an important part in the development of children's literature during this period. Colwell was the creator of the Children's Room at Hendon Library in London. When it opened in 1926, it became an early exemplar of a movement that, rather than enforcing a traditionally silent space, encouraged children's voices to be heard, not only within libraries, but also by those who created children's books. To give you some historical background to these developments, in the UK, prior to the end of the First World War, libraries were not particularly child-friendly spaces. In a challenging economic climate, it was felt by many that spending money on children's books was not a high priority. However, throughout the 1920s, there was an increasing awareness of the need for children to have dedicated library facilities. The advent of open access rooms that allowed children to choose their own books from the shelves of specialised children's department, rather than having to request them from behind a counter, entirely changed the way in which children were able to interact with the books on offer. They were able for the first time to browse the shelves and to discuss their choices, and librarians were able to observe this decision-making process at first hand. Where such progress was being made, it was driven by committed and professionally trained librarians, predominantly female, who had a vision of the sort of provision that they felt children needed and deserved, both in terms of the library environment and the quality of the books available to them. Eileen Colwell was at the vanguard of this new generation of children's librarians. She was trained and given the autonomy to select and present books in a way that became a model for libraries throughout the world. Upon graduation from University College London, her first full-time job was at a public library in Lancashire. She arrived with high hopes and a clear vision of the sort of library she wanted to provide for her children. She wrote in her autobiography, "At about the age of 11, when I realised that children were not welcomed in public libraries, indeed not always admitted, my dream of a library where children were welcome to borrow books, a place planned especially for them, where they could sit and read and feel free in a wealth of books, was born." However, the library she found herself in fell depressingly short of this vision. She wrote, "The only contact I had with children was through an indicator in the corner of the library. I would speak to the children peering through at me when I chanced to be there, but at the least suspicion of noise, the janitor swept them out of the library." Colwell also encountered institutional resistance to the more creative side of librarianship. She was told by her manager that her job was not to select books, but to process them for circulation, and that if she felt she had time for storytelling, then more jobs could certainly be found for her. In contrast, at Hendon, Colwell was instrumental in masterminding the design of a new children's room. She said, "I chose the sunniest room for the children. It was large and airy with many windows. The furniture was purpose designed in light oak. There were posters, flowers, and displays." Just as children's departments in publishing houses were rare spaces where women were able to assert their power and independence. So the children's room proved to be a place where Colwell could exercise her authority without hindrance. She recalls, "When I was in complete control and was free to organise any activities I could manage to carry out with the help of one assistant." This drive and energy, along with the freedom to act upon her ideas, would subsequently make Hendon the centre for British children's librarianship, and it attracted visitors from all over the world. Colwell initiated a series of innovations that has subsequently become accepted practice in library services for children. She led regular storytelling sessions in the library in order to bring books to life for children. This is her here, actually, doing her storytelling. Another example of her innovative thinking was her creation of the Book Week, which was later to become an annual fixture in schools and libraries across the country. Importantly, Colwell also encouraged the use of children as library assistants so they could take ownership of libraries as their space. In her words, the children's library became a busy place, with children reading, helping, occasionally playing, some chatting. In such an atmosphere, discipline was no problem, although children themselves could be very severe with one another. In instigating these changes, she faced down criticism from other areas of the profession who felt that librarians too should be silent and should be more concerned with cataloguing and shelving than with talking to their clientele. In contrast, far from believing that breaking children's silence would imply a loss of control, Colwell understood that this was not to be feared, rather that it should be encouraged if it promoted a mutual enjoyment of shared reading experiences. By inviting children to break their silence in the library, to talk to her about the books they were reading and the opinions they formed of them, Colwell was able to gain an insight into how children made decisions about their selection of reading material, how they interacted with the books they took down from the shelf, and what they wanted more or less of. She believed that one of the most interesting facets of my work has been watching the meeting between children and books. What decides a child in choosing a book to read? This insight fed into the many reviews, talks, and articles that Colwell wrote as her profile and reputation as an expert arbiter of children's literature grew internationally. She became much in demand as a storyteller, both in person and on television and radio, and she forged her own publishing career as the author of several anthologies of children's stories. The advent of open access children's reading rooms, with their invitation to children to browse and choose, chimed with a wider movement incipient in the 1930s, but gaining powerful momentum by the end of the 1950s, that allowed children far more control over their day-to-day lives than had previously been ideologically acceptable. Colwell's work at Hendon and beyond can be cited within this reconstruction of childhood that moved from the seen and not heard tradition to a more child-centric model that by the latter quarter of the 20th century had empowered children to have increased agency as consumers and to make themselves heard, both in libraries and in the wider cultural context. By allowing children's voices to be heard in her library, Colwell opened up new channels of communication between book, author, and reader. And such was her influence within the world of children's book publishing that editors sought her opinion on material to be selected for publication. As Colwell observed in 1957, the vast reading public of children is becoming vocal, and the publishers are awakening to the importance of that public. Colwell made the most of the opportunity to share her knowledge of what the children in her library told her they wanted to read. She observed that there is a closer liaison between librarians and publishers than there used to be. It is usual for publishers to consult the people whose life has been spent working with children, librarians and teachers, as to the books that are really needed and the merits of those already published. As far as publishers were concerned, librarians were key influencers and had a vital role in the success or failure of their children's lists. It was in their interest, therefore, to listen closely to what they had to say. To explore this further, I will now return to that publishing world and another close friend of Eileen Colwell, Eleanor Graham. Eleanor Graham was one of the most important and influential figures in mid-20th century British children's literature. Although she is now best remembered as the founding editor of the groundbreaking Puffin Storybooks imprint, Graham's influence on the wider field of children's literature was considerable and extended far beyond Puffin. Graham's early experience working in the children's department of London bookshop Bumpus Books informed her belief that children deserved books that were of a high quality, not only in their content, but in their design and print. As a child who had grown up in a not particularly happy home, she also understood the unique power and responsibility that books could wield in offering not only escape for children, but also information that could be trusted and which would help make sense of the world. This insistence on veracity and authenticity was to become Graham's overriding mantra throughout her long career in children's publishing. Like Grace Hogarth, Graham found that juvenile publishing in Britain in the early 1930s was in a parlous state. She summarised: no special editors, no recognised standards, no knowledgeable critics, bad libraries, bad schools, but a great many children's books were published, and not all were rubbish, although most people considered that any book for children came under that heading, almost any. She went on to observe that no one then had worked out what a children's book should be and do. The whole question of quality was to occupy a few people, myself among them, for most of the years from 1930 onward. In interrogating the purpose of children's literature, Graham considered a question that no one had asked before. This question of quality, of the sort of books that children should be exposed to, was a challenging one. And Graham is particularly interesting in that she not only had strong and influential opinions about these books, she also had a hands-on role in shaping this body of literature, both through her own writing and in her adaptations of others' works. Graham's first-hand observations of the way in which children and adults chose their books at Bumpus gave her an insight into what attracted them, the buying patterns they revealed, and how the way in which the books were displayed and marketed had an impact on their popularity. She developed her own understanding of what made a good book, as this was what she was consistently asked for. She wrote, "Mothers, aunts, and the rest came with only the haziest ideas of what to choose, but it had always to be a good book. I got so tired of that word. It seemed to be the only adjective, and for years after I left Bumpus's, I went on worrying at it. What was a good book for a child? I collected evidence in the children's room, but did not come to my own conclusion until much later on." Graham certainly had strict requirements for good reading material for children. She strongly believed that factual information could sit comfortably within fictional texts, and fiction, therefore, had a responsibility to its readers in much the same way as straight non-fiction to convey both practical and ideological instruction. Graham left Bumpus to become the secretary of the Junior Book Club, an organisation which promoted and reviewed children's books via a monthly newsletter. She became an important link between publishers, librarians, and schools. She was also a children's editor for both Heinemann and Methuen in the early 1930s and 1940s, as well as carrying out ad hoc work for other publishing houses. She had a regular children's book column in the Sunday Times during the 1930s, often writing about books she subsequently selected for the Puffin series. And finally, Graham herself was a children's author, and her best-known book is The Children Who Lived in a Barn, published in 1938. This varied career meant that Graham's influence spread far beyond the confines of just one imprint or publishing house. She was a regular reader for publishers who highly valued her opinion on manuscripts, often rejecting or accepting them on the basis of her verdict alone. Her authority within children's publishing was honed and reinforced during her time with the Junior Book Club. Publishers sent in proofs of books in advance of their publication for Graham to consider for inclusion in the regular club newsletters. Such was their perceived influence within the market. The timings of these lists impacted on planned publication dates for titles featured, and in an early example of cross-marketing, Graham's description of the titles on her list was sometimes printed on the book's wrappers. Through her work at Junior Book Club, Graham gained an insight into the commercial implications of the books published, as well as the creative side. She had a keen awareness of the influence of pricing on sales, writing in 1936 that there are mighty few people who are willing to pay that amount, 7 and 6, for a child's book. We have that brought home to us here through the members constantly. She was also very aware of the importance of a sustained long-term campaign to the ultimate success of a children's book, beginning with careful nursing. Graham's next role was to cement her position as a galvanizing force within mid-20th century children's publishing. Alan Lane, the innovative founder of Penguin Books, invited her to develop the Puffin list, envisaged as a children's imprint for Penguin readers of the future. Both Lane and Graham agreed that the series would feature only the finest children's fiction, what Graham called the best of the new classics of the new generation, and she was unwavering in fulfilling this remit as she understood it. In 1940, the enterprise got off to a somewhat shaky start in the face of opposition from other publishers. They were reluctant to hand over the rights to books that they would rather have published themselves, but due to wartime paper shortages were unable to. Librarians were equally suspicious, believing that some of these cheaper paperback editions would undermine their attempts to promote larger books with higher production values. Similarly, booksellers questioned the business sense of selling cheaper versions of the hardcover books for which they could get more money. However, under Graham's guidance, the series gradually gained momentum. As a businessman, Alan Lane appreciated Graham's clear identification of the market she wanted to reach, essentially the parents who bought all the puffins as they came out for their children. Graham firmly believed that her responsibilities lay primarily with her loyal readers. In the case of Enid Bagnall's National Velvet, for example, despite repeated approaches by colleagues, Graham was convinced that the book was inappropriate for a puffin reader. Although at first sight the title may be placed within the pony story category, Graham felt that its themes and content were for an older audience rather than the age group that Puffin catered to. She wrote, "The series is taken very much for granted as a safe bet as to quality and age suitability by parents, teachers, especially those in convent schools, and I'm pretty certain they would not want their 9 to 11s lapping it up. If the same children got hold of it from another series, that is quite another matter, and the parent or teacher would at least be aware that the book might not be as straightforward as it looks. To attach the puffin symbol is practically labelling it for children." As evidenced by this reference to convent schools, Graham's conception of a puffin reader was a rather narrow one, which reflected the children Graham had most regularly come into contact with at Bumpus. The sort of child who had birthday money to spend on good books, who had nannies and mothers to bring them along to browse, who went to schools with well-stocked libraries. In short, well-educated, privileged, middle-class children. Graham acknowledged the existence of readers from outside this narrow social category. She graciously professed to have the understanding that any child, even from the most ignorant and wretched home, yet possessed that same spark that lights the mind, yes, and spirit, to the appreciation of the wonder and beauty of good poetry. And she did make some, albeit limited, efforts to represent other sectors of society in the series. Indeed, Eve Garnett's Carnegie Award-winning portrayal of working-class childhood, The Family from One End Street, was one of the earliest books Graham selected for the Puffin series. She was certainly prejudiced against what she perceived as poorer quality fiction. Indeed, she was proud to provide books that were, in her words, something of a counterblast to those who were thinking in terms of Angela Brazil and Enid Blyton. I was, of course, frequently urged to get some Blyton on our list, but I never did. It was not intended for that kind of public. The number of Puffin books published annually under Graham was, by modern standards, small, but her mantra of quality over quantity meant that she would rather not publish at all than produce a book that did not meet her requirements. Indeed, she preferred to commission new writing than simply reprint substandard material. In 1985, there was an exhibition to celebrate 50 years of Puffin books. It's interesting that even at this point, recognition of Graham's work was waning. The whole of the period from 1941 to 1960, including Noel Carrington's picture puffins and Graham's puffin storybook output, was restricted to one panel of the exhibition. This was despite the fact that out of 16 puffin books identified at that point as million sellers, 6 of them were selected by Graham and published between 1941 and 1960. The fact that this period not only predated the so-called second golden age of children's literature, but also encompassed the challenges of wartime paper shortages and the initial antipathy of publishers towards new paperback imprints, makes Graham's achievements all the more worthy of greater recognition. By 1995, Graham's contribution to the field was more widely acknowledged than at the time of her death. Peter Hunt, in Children's Literature and Illustrated History, says that Eleanor Graham was one of the great influences on children's literature between the wars. Yet beyond the auspices of children's literature research, she remains, alongside her fellow bookwomen, as little more than a footnote in 20th century publishing history. The breadth of Graham's activities within this field, however, meant that she was able to exercise influence in a number of ways. She not only reviewed books after publication, but her readers' reports also determined whether text was selected for publication in the first place. She not only sold books in a bookshop, she also controlled a mail order subscription service that provided children's literature to libraries and schools across the world. As an editor, she not only selected books submitted for publication, but she was also proactive in seeking out new work through adaptations and translations. She not only wrote about children's books in newspapers, she talked about them in radio and television broadcasts. She was not only an editor, but an author. Each of these activities supported another, and all these facets of Graham's work epitomise the way in which the bookwomen of her generation were so effective in creating a network of professional capacities to influence and develop children's publishing. In the words of her friend Eileen Colwell, Graham was very much a pioneer in establishing the right of children's books to be considered as literature, requiring standards of production and writing as stringent as those for adults. Eleanor Graham's legacy, although not widely known or acknowledged, was huge. The growth of the children's publishing industry can be traced back to her work in fighting for it to be taken seriously, to be thought about, talked about, and valued. She ultimately succeeded in bringing children's literature into the spotlight whilst remaining herself in the shadows. To finish this talk where I started, I'll return to Grace Hogarth, who we left bringing Curious George to a very receptive young audience in the US. Having returned to England after the end of the war, Hogarth spent some years working as an agent for American publishers before securing her most influential role as head of the children's department at Constable Books. Hogarth's most significant contribution to children's publishing was twofold. Firstly, as an indefatigable networker and a passionate proponent of children's publishing, she positioned it as a valued and intrinsic part of the industry as a whole. In 1961, she established the Children's Book Circle, a forum and meeting place for all those working within the field. It remains in existence to this day and bestows the prestigious Eleanor Farjon Award for contribution to children's literature. Secondly, Hogarth was a huge advocate for the training and professional development of children's editors. Such was her energetic identification and support of young talent that a whole generation of editors, dubbed Grace's Girls, were given the skills and opportunities to ensure the continued development of children's books. This surely had a significant part to play in the emergence of that second golden age. I'll end there now, although these three women are only a small sample of the bookwomen who had such an impact on children's literature in varied ways during the period between 1930 to 1960. These women were unified in their belief of the importance of books to children's emotional and practical development. Their success can be measured in a number of ways. The increase in the profile of children's publishing, both in terms of institutional accolades such as prizes and medals, and in the increased coverage of children's literature within mainstream media such as book review pages. The creation of specialist children's departments within publishing houses and children's rooms in libraries, predominantly led by women. The beginnings of a new awareness for the need for diversity of content to reflect the diversity of readership, and the improvement in quality of print and design as new technologies were harnessed to produce higher quality books at the right price. Bookwomen played a key role in all these developments, and the impact of their legacy can still be felt today. Thank you very much.